G'day, podcasters. Just a special announcement following our interview with retired Lieutenant Colonel Gary McKay, MC. We are giving away, Gary has generously donated a signed copy of his book, In Good Company. And what you have to do to go into the running to win this book is you have to leave us a review. You have to share that review into our Facebook page, True Blue History, and also our Instagram page, True Blue History, and you will go in the running to win the signed copy of In Good Company from Gary, and we thank him very much for giving us a signed copy of that book. And the winner will be announced on the next podcast following Gary's podcast in a fortnight's time. So leave us a review and you go into the draw to win this amazing book, In Good Company. Thanks, guys. Thank you so much for the support, and we look forward to bringing you more great content in the future. Until then, stay safe. G'day. Welcome to True Blue History. I'm Adam Blum. Today's special guest is retired Lieutenant Colonel Gary McKay, MC. Gary is Australia's leading author about the Vietnam War. And Gary has joined us today to talk about his time in Vietnam in 1971. It is an absolute honour and a privilege to have Gary on the show. Hi, Gary. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks, mate.
So, Gary, you were Australia's most prolific writer about what many people would consider the most diverse war in Australia's history. In today's interview, we're going to focus on your autobiography book, In Good Company, which was your first book about the Vietnam War. This book is now used by a variety of military institutions, both here in Australia and overseas, including the Australian Defence Force Academy and the United States Marine Corps School of Infantry. Since you wrote about your experiences in Vietnam, have you been surprised at the success and the prestige your story has received, and how has this success impacted your life?
Oh, yes. Well, when I wrote In Good Company, it was the first autobiography to come out in Australia. And there'd been a few novels written about Vietnam by veterans, as it turned out. But mine was the first non-fiction account of what it was like in South Vietnam. It went gangbusters. My publishers, Allen and Unwin, promoted it well. And it took everybody by surprise. Some of my less gratuitous mates say, "Great book, Gaz, who wrote it?" But it went number one in non-fiction for about a month in Australia. And that started opening doors. If you can sell 5,000 copies of a non-fiction military book in Australia, that's usually its life. We sold 5,000 in 6 weeks. Then we sold another 5,000 in the next 3 months. And the other day I just got my royalty statement. We've done over 58,000 copies of In Good Company. It's still in print today. I wasn't allowed to tell any fibs because I was still serving in the army, and my mates would pull me out pretty quick. So, but it opened a lot of doors. All of a sudden I started being asked to give lectures or presentations, and it just changed everything.
So before you served in Vietnam, could you share with us if your family has a military history itself, like grandfathers, great-grandfathers, and can you just tell us where they served?
Yeah. My grandparents know, but my own family, mum and dad both served in Australia during the Second World War. Dad started off as a grunt, but then his brother, who'd been in North Africa, came back and claimed him, and he ended up serving the rest of his time out in transport. Mum who outranked Dad at the end of the war and never let him forget it. Mum became a telegraphist, and she did Morse code. She served all around Australia. She served when MacArthur came to University of Queensland and set his headquarters up there and in Brisbane. That's where she actually met Mum. That's where she met Dad. And then Mum, in about 1944, got transferred back to Western Australia, her birth state. And she actually served on Rottnest Island and was there right up until VJ Day at the end of the war. Mum then went back to Civvy Street. Dad had to serve for a couple of years after he got back, and he did that in a militia unit in Perth. His brothers, 3 of his brothers, served in the Second World War as well. And I had one uncle served in North Africa and another one served in the Southwest Pacific with 2nd 4th Commando.
For you, leading into Vietnam, there was a family history of service. So Australians were generally familiar with the locations and broad histories of the combatants in World War I and World War II and knew what was at stake. However, did you think that some of the anger about the introduction of conscription in 1964 was because people didn't have the same sense of familiarity about Vietnam and couldn't see how this war was relevant to Australia?
Poor old nations in the Western Hemisphere especially, they get churned up in the First World War. They have 20 years sort of break, and then they get churned up again into the Second World War. And 5 years after that, they're in Korea with communists. And, as far as Australians are concerned, I think communists were the only people that worked on the waterfront. But it just didn't make sense to a lot of people, I think. And I, for example, when I was conscripted in 1968, I didn't even know where Vietnam was. I didn't know which side of the equator. I really didn't give a rat's bum, because when you're 19 and 20, all you're worried about is footy, surfing, the opposite sex, and pulling a wage. That's all you're worried about. And nothing else. So I think there was a lot more anger about the fact that conscription, when it was introduced, and then people started getting called up under that act, because Australia couldn't afford to have total conscription or universal conscription, and it was only for males, which seemed to be the right thing in those days, but it was a ballot, so it was a big lottery. And I think that's what cheesed off guys more than anything, was that how come I'm going and it depended on your birthday. So that was it.
So you mentioned that when you were called up in 1968 and your father, he dropped you off at the army depot in Marrickville. What were your thoughts about the protesters when you were dropped off at the front gate?
Yeah, it was interesting. Dad, he was a builder. He took the morning off. It was a weekday, and I had my little suitcase, and I used to have shoulder length hair then because I was a bit of a surfer. Anyway, I'd had a haircut under my father's advice, and had all my gear in one little suitcase, and parked the car, and we walked up to the front gate of Marrickville, and the Save Our Sons movement, all these ladies were in full cry. And it was quite an eye-opener. There were coppers there, keeping the savage women at bay, and the old man shook my hand and said, "Best of luck, see you when you get some leave." And, we'd had a couple of chats about going into the army and all that sort of stuff. And he told me a couple of lies. One was that officers got better pay than other ranks, and that wasn't true when I found out that my sergeant earned more money than me, and that the food was better in the officers' mess, and that was a lie as well. It was better in the sergeant's mess because that's where the War of Cicada lived. Anyway, Yeah, it was a bit of an eye-opener. You know, I didn't realise there was this anger in the community until I mean, I'd seen a bit on TV, but not much. But when I saw all these women out there, you know, quite passionate about it, it was a bit of an eye-opener.
Because how old were you, Gary, at the time in 1968?
I was 20.
So for a 20-year-old, that would be in your face, very much an eye-opener to how people felt.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, all of us inductees were standing underneath the palm trees at Marrickville looking out at the gate, and one guy said, "This is so embarrassing." I said, "Why?" He said, "My mum's out there." And I said, "Oh, good on her, you know." Yeah, the guys were it was a sort of fait accompli, you know.
Absolutely. So given your personal experiences with being conscripted, what are your thoughts about conscription today? Is it a controversial topic and people still have strong feelings on what happened with conscription? And however, do you think it should never be introduced again, or do you think that there are certain circumstances where it is an appropriate option? And if so, what might they be?
I think conscription, well, it was good for me. And, you know, every couple of years my platoon gets together and the national servicemen in my platoon have no gripes about being conscripted. I've done a lot of interviews myself for the books I've done with conscripts, and some of them have told me that it was the best thing that ever happened to them and wish they'd stayed in. But, you know, there's always family pressures. I would like to see conscription reintroduced, but not necessarily for the military. I'd like to see national service, and that is you could have an option of going into the military, or you could go into something like, you know, the engineer corps that would do civil engineering projects for the country to make the country. For example, let's get a high-speed rail down to Melbourne or Brisbane or whatever. You know, something like that. But it is expensive, and for military service, it is very expensive. I mean, each soldier costs more than $30,000, I think it is, just to train as a basic private soldier. So it's a very expensive exercise. I think it doesn't do anyone any harm for the discipline, and also to know how to look after yourself in the field and all that. Should we have national service again, the reasons for it would have to be if Australia was under threat, I think. And I don't think people would then have any qualms about it. They realise that we've got to defend ourselves. Well, that's what we do. We're not going to roll over and have our tummies tickled. That would be the circumstance, only if the country was at threat. But I would like to see national service to fill in that gap year between when they leave school and when they want to start college or university.
So looking back, overall, what did you feel that was, for your experience with conscription, was it a positive or negative experience for you?
Oh, it was positive for me. Because I got selected to go to the officer training unit at Skyville, where we did a 6-month commissioning course, where the exit point of the course was very small. We were trained to lead a rifle platoon on operations in South Vietnam against the Viet Cong. It was that small an exit point. So we were highly trained to that end. The beauty about my officer training in conscription was that it took my blinkers off. It made me very much aware of what I was capable of physically and mentally, and also realised that I had some talents and skills that I hadn't really been made aware of, but they were highlighted and polished up when I became a young officer.
In the book, you talk about determination to get to Vietnam and the efforts you made to get there. What had changed your perspective from not caring about what was happening in Vietnam prior to your conscription to your desire to get there? Was it purely to participate in the war, or was there something more for you?
I think Well, what happened was after I graduated in October '68, they sent me to Singleton to the 3rd Training Battalion, where we trained national servicemen to be private soldiers, and then there were 2 companies allocated to training soldiers to be infantry. And when I marched in there, the adjutant of the unit was a bloke called Brian Kelleher, whose brother was a Wallaby winger, and Brian was a mad rugby player himself, and a coach. And so we had a rugby team in the Hunter Valley rugby comp, and so I started playing rugby. Then, because I'd already played rep rugby as a junior for Gordon Northern Districts, I suddenly became the captain of the footy team, and instead of being sent off to the reinforcement wing to go to Vietnam, I stayed in the Hunter Valley at Singleton until we won the grand final in the Hunter Valley comp, and the very next weekend, once we'd won the grand final, they booted me out. And they sent me to to Enoggera Barracks in Brisbane. So now I've spent 18 months of my 2 years national service training to be an officer, playing footy and honing my skills as a young platoon commander, and all of a sudden I'm sent to 9 RAR in Brisbane, which is just coming back from Vietnam. And I'm going to spend the next 6 months doing nothing with all these guys who've been there, done that, and got a couple of service ribbons, and I'm not going to do anything. And I thought, no. And I was only 21, so testosterone takes over. And I think secretly, I'd been watching my own performance against guys who'd been there, done that, and I thought, I want to see if I can cut the mustard. And so I wrote a letter to the military secretary saying I should go to Vietnam, and I was prepared to sign on for another year to do it. My commanding officer intercepted this letter because it was addressed to the military secretary, and someone brought his attention to it, and Second Lieutenant McKay was paraded. The letter was opened. He then put a covering letter on it recommending that I go. And before you could say Jack Robinson, I was joining 4 RAR, who at that stage were doing their battle efficiency course at Canungra. So instead of turning left at the front gate, I turned right and went to Canungra and joined my platoon 6 months prior to going to Vietnam. 6 months prior to going to Vietnam. I really wanted to see if I could do the job. And so I signed an extension, and I would do a full tour of duty in South Vietnam.
Can you share with us what were your initial thoughts about Vietnam when you arrived, and what concerned you most about your enemy?
Right, there's a few things there. Well, we went up on the HMAS Sydney, and then we got airlifted off the flight deck in a CH-47. Never been in a Chinook before. Anywhere, because the Australian Air Force or Army didn't have them, and so we flew at about 500 feet across this pock-marked landscape below us, full of, everywhere you looked there were bomb crater holes full of water, and and it was verdant, lush green, and of course, it's very hot and humid. And when we touched down and walked out the back of that Chinook down the back ramp, the heat and the humidity were just like a big, wet, hot blanket being thrown over you. Onto the back of trucks, down to our lines, and started settling in. You suddenly realise that you're now in a country at war, because everyone's in uniform, everyone's got a gun in their hands, whether it be a sidearm or a rifle or whatever, and it's just all military. We're just in the middle of Nui Dat base, and it's just full on. And didn't even go to Saigon. I didn't get to Saigon until 20 years later. It was just that immediate. I mean, we've been up in Townsville, but the heat and humidity were just another notch up the ratchet. And the second part of your question was what was good or what bad about it or whatever, or what did I expect? once we'd settled in and we had our familiarisation and we had to have all these briefings about the minimum distance now for calling in artillery and mortars, because no longer were we in the training environment of Australia. Now we're in a war zone. So everything just got cut to the bone, and we started doing workup training, and in the first week everyone got the shits with the runs, and I didn't, because I was better than everybody. And then it hit me 10 days later and I realised, no, I'm not. And you realise very quickly that you had to be on your toes all the time. And once we got out in the weeds, you realised why we did all this special sort of training that we did, because that's what gets you through it, is your training. And everything became second nature to us. The way you held your weapon, you searched your arcs, you put on your camouflage, the way you gave field signals with the correct hand, and the way you just kept your spacing and kept looking at everybody else to make sure everything was going on. Everything just sharpened and came into focus. And I think that's what it was like, for that first couple of weeks. Yeah.
So, with you being in Vietnam, had you studied your enemy before you went to Vietnam, and did you know much about the enemy that you were facing?
Absolutely, and that was the beauty of Conungra. Doing the battle efficiency course, everything was focused on who your enemy were. They even had villages built with tunnel systems underneath, and we practiced coordinate search, and we practiced that all the time. When we went on exercises up at high range outside of Townsville and Shoalwater Bay near Rocky, everything was aimed at that. And you realised you very rarely moved as a rifle company. Everything was done at platoon level, because that's what you were going to do in South Vietnam. And it became a war in the shadows. You were constantly in the scrub, constantly under the canopy, always on your feet, always moving, and you just got that drilled into you. And the enemy who we were training against, played their role. They carried AKs, they dressed in dark clothes, which were usually greens dyed maroon or black. And that's the way we played it. We had training PAMs on the enemy, and every week back in barracks in Townsville, there would be the CO's night training sessions for officers and senior NCOs. And we would get lessons from Vietnam every week. So the units that were there would give you the latest situation reports, contact reports, intelligence summaries, and it was just build up, build up, build up. And that even continued for the 10-day voyage to Vietnam from Townsville. We were still doing IAs and getting lectures and even the latest things that were happening.
So you mentioned it was done at platoon level. For the listeners who aren't aware, how many were in a platoon, Gary?
35.
35. So when you went out patrolling in the jungle, was all 35 out with you, or?
I wish. It never happened. Maybe on our warm-up X at the beginning, but that was probably the first and last time it ever happened, because you always had to provide guys for rear details to man the perimeter while you're away. So you'd lose 2 men just for that out of each platoon. And then you have guys who have some sort of medical condition. If you're going to go ambushing, you're not going to take someone with a terrible cough. Guys, when we went into the wet season, we got down, I think the lowest we ever got was 22. And so we changed the platoon structure, and we switched into 4 sections of about 5, right? And so or a 4-man section of a brick, no rifles. Everyone had an automatic weapon, and the platoon sergeant had one half the platoon, and I had the other, and we had 4 bricks, and that's the way we operated. We just had to adapt, because we had guys with sprained knees, sprained ankles, slipping over with a full pack and ripping their tendons apart. Guys with upper respiratory tract infections, guys with all sorts of complaints. Because when we went out bush, we went out for 6 weeks at a time on hard rations in a pretty nasty environment. It was fetid, it was wet, hot, humid. Not as hot as being out in the open. It was a bit cooler under the canopy, but it's still 32 degrees and 100% humidity most days,
And over in Vietnam, it's very tropical, isn't it? So there's rain and monsoons that happen, and so if you were out for 6 weeks, if you got wet, that was it, weren't you? You stayed wet, like you didn't.
You were wet from sweat. Yeah. Look, there's 2 seasons in Vietnam, dry and wet, and the dry is hotter than the wet. But in the wet season, every afternoon it would piss down. I mean, hammer down. And so you try to get under your hoochies by about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because that's when the rain would start to come. But in the dry season, once you got up in the morning and started patrolling, your shirt was wet with sweat. And we were very fit, but you still sweat. And your shirt would stay wet all day on your back until you stopped patrolling, and then you would dry your shirt out and get under your mosquito net that night, and then put your dry shirt back on for at least a half an hour of comfort before it got wet again. And that's what it would be like day in, day out, because every day when we were patrolling, we're doing between 8 and 10 kilometres a day, but we're walking very slowly. With a full pack on your back, 30 odd kilos of equipment on you. So you're not running anywhere, it's just carrying that load and also being alert.
So you mentioned that out patrolling, and what type of weapons were you using, and what type of weapons were the enemy using?
Okay, if you're going in a rifle section, you had your scouts with M16s, or for the earlier tours, the AR-15. So we had the M16 in 1971, and then I think we had the M16A1 towards the end. The soldiers, the riflemen, carried the SLR. The squad automatic weapon was the GPM GM60, and the number 2 on the gun carried an SLR. Each section, usually the section 2IC, carried an M79 grenade launcher, 40mm. But halfway through our tour, we got issued with the XM203. It was the experimental model under and over. No training plan, mind you. No instructions. So we went down the range, figured it out. The range was pointed towards Long Tan. Figured it out how to use it. Yep, not a problem. It was just an M16 with an M79 underneath it. And the signaller carried an M16. Medic carried, or the stretcher bearer in your platoon carried an SLR. Platoon sergeant and I, we carried M16s, but my sergeant, his brother was with the training team, and he got us 30-round magazines, which was a hell of a lot better than having a 20-round box magazine. In the enemy, most of their soldiers carried the AK-47, which is 7.62 short. Their machine guns varied. Their light machine gun was an RPD. And when we got into heavy fighting with the North Vietnamese, we found that they also had 12.7 heavy machine, or 50 cal, which was a brute of a weapon. We ran into some enemy who were carrying all manner of weapons that they'd got off the French or had captured. I mean, in one battle, my platoon recaptured an American M60, which we hung on to. And so my platoon then had 4 M60s in the platoon. And we used one as a floating gun to give us more firepower in the lead section. Because everywhere you went was basically in single file through the J. The enemy also used RPG-2s and RPG-7s. And they also, other things they had were grenades. We had M26 grenades, and we had them in fragmentation, but we also had white phos grenades and coloured smoke. They also had a wooden hand grenade, which looked very much like the German World War II potato masher, where you pull string on the bottom, but not very reliable. That was about it as far as the enemy. And occasionally you'd see an officer with a sidearm, like a pistol. The only people who carried pistols in our group were usually the SIGs. Yeah, that was about it.
So you mentioned out on patrol. So if you came across the enemy and had a contact, what would you with your eating when you stopped for the night? What would you cook a meal, or would you eat cold, or what did you do if you came across the enemy?
Well, it depends on how long ago it was. If we had a day where we didn't have a contact, we'd eat hot when we could. If we had a contact in the afternoon, we would eat cold that night, if we ate. Because sometimes you might be going straight, you might do a track squat to see if they're going to follow you up, so you're not going to eat at all. So you just pull a chocolate bar or something out and you munch on that and have a drink of water, and that'd be it. But generally the rule was, if you'd had contact within half a dozen hours, you go cold. Don't risk the smell of cooking in case anyone's following you up.
So while you're out patrolling for 6 weeks, did you have like specific drops of depots for resupply and all that sort of thing, or?
Well, when we're out, usually resupply every 5 days with combat rations and anything else you might need. If you had a contact where you might have gone through maybe 1,000 rounds of ammo for the whole platoon, they'd drop in ammo preloaded in the magazines. Every 10 days, we would get a big resupply, and that meant a change of clothes. So you'd take off all your dirty clothes and put on clean greens that had been through the laundry, and you'd also get socks in that. No one wore underwear because it just rotted off you. So everyone went commando. No one wore a singlet. I mean, that was just a waste of effort. And in the 10-day resupply, you'd get, the cooks would send out some fresh rations, which would be a small carton of flavoured milk and a salad roll, which was something to die for. And the Yanks also had a thing called the supplementary ration pack, and that had in it cigarettes, chewing tobacco, and all sorts of crap, which we didn't. I didn't smoke, but the diggers would look forward to that. Not because you didn't get many opportunities to have a cigarette during a day. They also had Hershey bars and shaving cream we banned because it smelt. But that was about it.
You just touched on the Americans, and the attitudes were different between the Australians and the Americans. What was your impression of the American soldiers in Vietnam?
Well, you got to remember, down in Phuoc Tuy province, we were in a backwater compared to I Corps up on the demilitarised zone. I mean, we still had our moments down in Phuoc Tuy, but the American soldiers' army that was sent down in that area were the product of a very large sausage machine in the United States. They had a trickle reinforcement system, which means that they were always fragmented. We always had a block reinforcement. We trained together before going to Vietnam. We served together in Vietnam, and we came home together. The only people that had a trill system in Australia, in Vietnam, that were Australians were the cavalry, and even the artillery used to change as a battery. But most of the units, the logistic units all had trickle reinforcement, but the combat units did a block reinforcement. We met the Yanks a couple of times out in the field, and we were totally unimpressed. Their level of training was rudimentary. Their noise discipline was non-existent. Their litter discipline was worse. They were noisy, and we moved away from them as quickly as we could. It wasn't their fault. They just didn't know any better, and they learned from us, and they changed it. The US Marine Corps were all volunteers, and I had more than enough time for the Marines. We worked with a US Marine officer, McKay, and he was truly professional, and so were the diggers that worked for him. He was our naval offshore gunfire liaison officer with his own helicopter, and he was very professional. And the Marines that we met when we were downtown, they were very professional as well.
So, unlike their fathers and grandfathers who'd fought in trenches during World War I and World War II, you share how search and destroy, seek and destroy became the dominant strategy used in the Vietnam War. Can you share with us how the helicopters influenced the use of these tactics for counter-guerrilla warfare and the advantages and disadvantages of this tactic?
Yeah, the helicopter introduced what now becomes known as the vertical flank. And the beauty of the chopper was we could be redeployed rapidly. So you can get troops on the ground very quickly. The disadvantage is what we call the vertical flank. And the advantage of that was you could redeploy troops rapidly. So you could get good combat power on the ground in a very short period of time and therefore influence the battle. The disadvantage in using the choppers, of course, is the noise. And a plug for one of my books, I did a book called Sleeping with Your Ears Open, which became known as On Patrol with the SAS. And those guys developed really good techniques for inserting by chopper, where they do dummy insertions and they keep the doors closed so the enemy couldn't see how they were doing it. Insertions at treetop level, which can be exciting. It really did change the mode of the way in which we fought. And of course, at the end of it, when it was all over, the helicopter greatly influenced battlefield evacuation for casualties and totally changed the status of soldiers who were wounded. That's why we had so many soldiers who survived being wounded, was because of the helicopter.
So you talk about search and destroy. So when you were going, were you in search of the enemy in villages as you were patrolling through them, or what was the idea behind the search and destroy?
Okay, the idea was you get intelligence reports, and this might be from other units or from the SAS who are out doing deep reconnaissance, saying, we know there are enemy in this area. And even the aircraft doing their morning patrols, they would see sign that the enemy had crossed one of the Firestone or the Brimstone trails where they've cleared it. And they would say the enemy have got to be in that area. And radio intercept would all zero in on them as well. And so we would go into an area and you would be allocated a company area of operations, for example. Then we'd split up. Company headquarters and one platoon would go up the guts, and the other two platoons would, and you'd each have a little platoon area of operations to search. We did a lot of searching along creeks and rivers because no self-respecting enemy is going to be too far from water and to have to dig a big hole. So we did a lot of riverine and creek line searching to find where the enemy camps would be. Sometimes we do a hammer and anvil where you'd put a blocking force at one end and sweep up towards it. But that were usually for the bigger ops. But the idea was to go out, find them, fix them, and then destroy them. That was the idea of search and destroy. If we wanted to do a village search to just root out any sympathisers or supporters or even Carter that are hiding in a village, that'd be a search. That'd be a coordinate search operation where you get around a village, coordinate, then sweep through. And you often do that with the South Vietnamese as well, so you've got plenty of linguists. But a search and destroy was to go out there to find their enemy camps, their base camps in the jungle, because their camps are in the jungle. And then there was a search and clear, and often you'd just get an area and sweep it. And if it was negative, it was good because it meant they weren't in there, they had to be somewhere else. So they were the two types of ops.
We move on to the Battle of Neuilly Lay, and can you tell us through the events that led to the Battle of Neuilly Lay, which occurred when the withdrawal of Australian troops from Vietnam was already underway, and which troops were involved in this battle? And you've written that something that isn't in the battle history was a blue-on-blue incident. What is that, and when did it occur?
I'll talk about the blue on blue at the end of the Neuilly Lay battle. So in August 1971, the government announced to all and sundry that we're going to withdraw. Thank you very much, politicians, because that then just arced the enemy up to get them to come back into Phuoc Tuy province, because we pushed them out after a battle, after a big operation called Overlord, and they'd got a real hiding and they withdrew out of the province. And when it was announced that we would be withdrawing in August, the 33rd Regiment, which was North Vietnamese, and they were a battle-hardened group. I've been to their memorial site in Bin Ba, and their honour roll starts in 1947 against the French. Right, well, sorry, it starts earlier than that. 47. Yeah, all the way up through to the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and then they were constantly training and fighting in the Second Indochina War. So they only had a couple of years off and they were back into it again in 1960, right? And their honour roll stops in 1975, right? Yeah. So these guys had been around, and the 33rd Regiment had 3 battalions, and they were very slick. They were hard, tough cookies. They decided to come back into Phuoc Tuy province, to come down to Nui Dat and kick our ass one last time, or have a go at it, before we withdrew. Now, you've got to remember, we're down to 1 battalion in the task force. Instead of 3 battalions, we're now down to 1, because 3 RARs packing up and going home. Some bright spark decided that we didn't need armour anymore, so all the Centurions have been driven down to Vung Tau, and they've had the turrets taken off them so the crane can lift them back up onto the HMAS Sydney. So we've only got APCs and light infantry and our artillery, thank God. And that's only 105 anyway, although we did have some American 8-inch SPs in the province. So the word gets out that the enemy are on the move again, and you have to be proactive in these things. So rather than wait for them to come to you, we went out bush on an operation called Ivanhoe. And this was the last major offensive operation by Australians in Vietnam. So it was the first week in September, and we deployed. And there was nothing on the left-hand side of the main road going up north. So we redeployed across to the eastern side of Route 2. And once we got across to that side, we started finding signs that the enemy were in the area. We had a couple of minor contacts, and then on the 18th of September, I think it was, we had that blue on blue incident, which I'll talk about later. And then we no sooner got over that, and we started moving up towards a set of hills called Nui Lay and Nui Sao, as in Sao spelt like Sao biscuit. If you looked at the int map before we went, it was just all red dots. It looked like it had the measles. There are always contacts in that area because it was close to the province boundary where they like to hang around because people don't like going too close to their boundaries. On the 20th of September, my platoon was patrolling along and we came across a very heavily used footpad through the bush. One of my diggers was a trained tracker, and he came up and I said, well, what do you think of that? And he said, I think I want to go and leave. I said, how many enemy have gone along this track? Now, we had 30 in the platoon because I also had an FO party with me of a bombardier and a SIG. He said, a couple of hundred. That sort of dries your mouth out real quick. And I'm just travelling as a platoon. No sooner had he come up and seen that, I had my guns deployed each side along, looking up and down the track, then the enemy came bowling around the corner in pith helmets, chest webbing and AK-47s, and a platoon of them, bowling down the track, full tit. One of my gunners carrying the floating gun, the American gun we'd recaptured, he opened up, stitched up a couple of them. My sergeant, who was standing next to me, made me deaf in my right ear by engaging next to my ear hole, and it was on. And we had a platoon-on-platoon contact for about half an hour. I did a right hook on him, he did a left hook on me, I then did a left hook on him, and we're using whistle blasts, and so was he. In the end, I decided to just 2 sections up the guts, throwing grenades, and we got 4 of them, and they withdrew with blood trails. Not one in my platoon. No one was hit. I hadn't had anyone wounded in the 7 months we'd been there, and we'd had a lot of contacts and been in a few battles. So, we go into all-round defence. We pick up the enemy dead, drag them back in, and they're all young kids, about 19. They're North Vietnamese. They've got jungle boots on, chest webbing, canvas pith helmets, belt buckles, and their little backpacks were all packed exactly the same, with spare ammunition in oilcloths, rice, spare clothing. Everything was packed neat as a die. They were disciplined troops. So I sent a track report in and a contact report, and then we went into the bush, did a coat hook, sat there at 50% stand to all night. And then the next morning got up, swept around, and then moved off. And now it's the 21st of September. And bugging me dead, we go up about 400 metres and we see another track coming in, joining this one, all heading towards a hill called Nui Lay, which is 1.5 kilometre away, probably. Maybe 2 clicks. And it's as big as this other track that we'd seen. I think, geez. Again, it's got to be another couple of hundred enemy, and all the branches are broken each side of the track, indicating they're carrying something, like heavy weapons or whatever. Makes your heart beat fast. In the meantime, so I stopped there at the confluence of these 2 tracks, and I'm told stay there because 12 platoons in the middle of a contact, and they're on the other side, they're 2 clicks away, and they're into it, and they're at the base of the Nui Lay area, following a track just like mine. Again, all heading towards Inouye, but on the other side. And Graham Spinkson and 12 Platoon had a contact. Jimmy Duff got killed when he got hit with a RPG, and 3 or 4 guys got wounded. And Graham's in the real big shit fight, and it's just at the start of this bunker system. So I'm told stay where I am, which I'm very happy to do, and company headquarters is closing up on 12 Platoon in the middle. And as I'm doing that, the enemy come down through the low ground and try to attack me as I'm on the other side of this track. Luckily, I deployed a bank of claymores, and my platoon had all got their spare ammo out. We knew this was going to be a big day. We'd already used half of our ammo the night before, that afternoon before. So we're getting low on ammo. Anyway, they came up and I told no one to fire until I'd fired the claymores and then only at given targets. There would have been 60 enemy, shoulder to shoulder, with their AKs at the hip. And they came up and then they started firing. But it was all going over our heads because we're laying down next to trees, taking cover, and we're in a basic triangle, inverted triangle. I fired a blank of claymores, ripped a big hole in their assault line, and they withdrew. I was then told, get your ass out of there. But before we could do that, they had another crack at us, but I flipped the platoon about 100 metres and we went to ground again, and everyone's reloading their weapons, and they had another crack at us, but again, we beat them off. And then we beetled, flat chat, no security, I got to tell you, we just went for it. Single file through the bush, best speed, because we didn't want to get flanked by the enemy. So we joined company headquarters and 10 Platoon, and 12 Platoon's contact had finished, but it's fairly evident there's bunkers because of the spoil around trees, and so the company gets together. And by now it's getting close to lunchtime, and choppers overhead are pointing out lots of enemy on the top of the hill who've got a 12.7 on a tripod in an anti-aircraft role. This is a combat indicator that you're up against a lot of enemy, and they could see a lot of enemy moving on the top of this hill, and they're talking hundreds of enemy. And by this stage, the company's together. It's only about 100 strong, 110 maybe. And I need ammunition resupply. The commanding officer comes over, Jim Hughes, in a Kiowa, driven by a classmate of mine, John Sonneveld, who was to win a Distinguished Flying Cross this day, and free drops ammunition, nearly killing my sergeant. Right, these sandbags come dropping through the bush. Darryl then said to me, my sergeant starts distributing all the ammo. We bomb up again, and we get ready for what's going to follow. Meanwhile, aircraft are circling over and they're getting shot at from all number of people in this bunker system. We could not do a recce of the bunker system. It was too big. And any movement on the flanks, you just got hammered. It was like a large X. So no matter which angle you came on, you're going to come into a crossfire. So they hammered it with artillery and then air. And then my platoon, which was on the right-hand side of the thing, we started getting enemy sneaking around. So we had an F4 Phantom napalm strike about 100 metres from the platoon, which is awe-inspiring if nothing else. And that stopped them from doing that. We had to have another resupply because we had guys shooting at enemy and chewing through their ammo. It wasn't just willy-nilly, it was bang, bang here and bang, bang there. And then at about mid-afternoon, they'd hit this thing with F4s, Sky Raiders with 500-pound, 250-pound bombs, bombed the crap out of this thing. And the enemy was seen withdrawing over the top of the Nuile feature. And we thought, right, they're leaving. They've had enough. So we get the word that we're going to do a formal company attack into the bunkers. And this is never good. You always take casualties in bunkers. And we had our first company casualty when we did bunkers back in July. And I was not looking forward to this at all. But we decided that I had the right forward assault platoon. So I had 2 sections up and 1 in depth in single file on the flank, so we could look after the flank because we didn't know how wide the system was. And away we went. We just pepper potted, crawling, fire movement. We probably got 50 metres into the bunkers, and they were very hard to see. They were beautifully camouflaged. And the sky fell in, and noise like I'd never heard before. I'd heard it in the bunker attack we did on the Song car in July, but this was even worse. It was so deafening, diggers 10 feet from me couldn't hear my voice. And it was just continual light machine gun, AK-47, RPGs being shot into the trees above our heads. It was on. Everyone was trying to find cover. The trees were skinny there, unfortunately, and it was hard to find good cover. I was using my pack. I'd taken off my pack and I was using that as cover from fire. I had the shit shot out of it. Never saw that pack. It was my favourite. It was a Special Forces pack. Never saw it again. Anyway, we're about half an hour into this battle, and artillery was dropping. We're trying to walk the artillery close to dissuade the enemy and get them to break contact, but they wouldn't, and they hugged our belt. And then after a while, all my guns were quiet in my assault sections. And I tried to kneel up next to a tree to see what was going on, and I could see one of my gun crews, and they were inoperative. They were just laying there. And I had another gun crew a little bit further down the hill. There was a slight hill. This is thickly vegetated, but that vegetation was being quickly eroded by the number of bullets flying through the air from the enemy. And then I saw the enemy getting up through behind the bunkers, and they were going to do an assault. No one could hear me. So it was useless me trying to tell someone to get up to the gun. So it's one of those cases where you got to do what you got to do. So I got up, ran forward about 20 metres, if that, and skidded down beside my 2 gun crew there, and they were both dead. And they'd both been headshot. So I rolled them over, took a dog tag off each guy, put it in my pocket, got the gun working, and looked over to my right, and I saw one of my soldiers, Private Kevin Casson, nicknamed Fred. I saw him doing the same thing I did, and he skidded in behind the other gun crew. But one of those guys was mortally wounded, and that was a bloke called Ralph Niblett, who ended up being the last Australian to die on active service. And Kevin got that gun going, and he could see me. I gave him a thumbs up, he gave a thumbs up, and we destroyed the enemy that were now assaulting towards us like they'd done earlier in the day. We thwarted that attack. And in the meantime, my radio operator is acting as me on the back to company headquarters, telling him the boss has gone forward, we're in deep shit, blah, blah, blah. 12 platoon on our left flank had heavy contact, but they weren't getting the brunt of the assault like I was. So Graham's Pinkston's platoon was able to put covering enfilade fire into them, and we were holding the fort. And I thought my guys would be able to come forward and that, but the fire was so intense that as soon as you moved, you drew fire. And how Kevin and I weren't wounded there was amazing. Anyway, Barry Garrett, my radar operator, came wriggling forward and he said, boss had said, we've got to pull back. Believe it or not, Adam, we had never trained to go backwards. We didn't do it. We never did that. We're Australians. We don't go backwards. We go forwards. So we had to figure out this. So Kevin could see me and I was giving him field signals like, you fire, I'll go back. So we did 5 metre bounds and I had to get all the ammo I could off the dead guys, which I had to use their bodies as cover from fire. That's how bad it was. And Kevin was doing the same. So I yelled out, give me covering fire. I don't know if you heard me or not, but he went duck, duck, duck. And we're doing 5-round short bursts. So Kevin covered me, I went back, then I covered Kevin, and then we fought our way back to where my original position was. Then the section commanders closed in on me, and I said, right, this is what we're going to do, fighting withdrawal, pepper pot backwards. This is what we're doing. I handed the gun over to a bloke called Bob Sims, who took that gun, and found my rifle, and away we went. And we got back to company headquarters where a defensive line had been pulled up and Warren Dow, one of the section commanders, was playing traffic cop, putting people on the ground. We then went into all-round defence. My platoon sergeant had been wounded. He'd already gone, choppered out, and another chopper was coming in to take out the mortally wounded machine gunner Ralph Niblett. He was taken out, but he died on the helicopter. We were then told, it's now 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Light is starting to fade under the canopy. We're told, right, we're going to pull back. They're going to hit this with a B-52 strike. They're going to hammer it with everything they've got. We're going to go single file, 1 kilometre, Company Harbour, tight, and wait. And then we'll go back in the morning. Unfortunately, the 3 machine gunners, 2 that I had and 1 that Kevin had, I had to leave on the battlefield because to try and get those men out would have been more casualties. Tough decision to make. Anyway, we then withdrew. 10 platoon led, and then I was next, and then 12 platoon brought up the rear. We went about 700 odd metres, went into all-round defence. As we're putting 10 platoon had gone down, then I'm taking my platoon to go from 8 to 12. And as we went around this chili bush, some diggers said to me in 10 platoon, we heard voices over there pointing to our left flank. As Kevin and he was following me, Bob Sims was following me. As we went around this chili bush, I heard Bob say, oh no. I turned around to my left. He dropped down onto one knee with a machine gun, pulled it up to the shoulder, and then there were 4 enemies sitting on top of a bunker having a meal, eating with chopsticks. And they're only 25 metres away. So he stitches them up and all shit breaks loose again. So we've withdrawn into another bunker system, which we think was a guard system for the big one. And we'd pull back into the guard. Oh, lovely. Frying pan into the fire. So I'm desperately trying to get my diggers around at 12 o'clock, dropping guys in pairs. And this is a very tight company night defensive position. It wouldn't have been 50 metres from one side to the other. So I've dropped guys in pairs and I'm trying to get everything coordinated. And every time I said something, green tracer would go zipping past my head. So I'm next to this tree and I've got the guys all down and all of a sudden I hear this huge bang, like huge bang. I thought, shit, that was close. An RPG's hit the tree. Then I realised I'd been knocked off my weapon and the big bang I heard was 2 bullets ripping into my shoulder and they were AKs. And this guy who I was shooting at, I thought was at the base of a tree 15, 20 metres away. The bugger was actually up the tree, and he'd tied himself in a tree like a sentry. And I couldn't pick that in the dark, because now it's quite dark. And anyway, I got nailed. No one else got shot in the whole company. It had to be me. So I think I must have blacked out for a while. And then the next minute, my medic, Frank Wessing, and the company medic, who was to be awarded a military medal for bravery because of his actions this day, Mick is there, Mick O'Sullivan his name, and he was medical corps. And Mick comes up, and Frank and Mick then get me by the webbing, clunk, 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 and they drag me back into the company position, into the middle. My platoon is now no sergeant, no platoon commander. The FOAC is there, a bombardier. So I tell him, you're now the platoon commander. His eyes widened, and he said, we're not going anywhere, mate. Just answer the radio. So him and Barry are the platoon headquarters, and his SIG. So I didn't want to disrupt the section, so we weren't going anywhere. We're just going to stand and fight. And we honestly thought, speaking with my guys years later, we thought we weren't going to come out of this. We thought they'll overrun us because there were just so many of them. The artillery is called in fire mission danger close on 3 sides, and they fire hundreds of rounds. In the end, at about 9 o'clock, they asked for a reprieve. And as soon as they did that, the enemy withdrew. They just hugged our belt to get inside the fire mission danger close. Anyway, this is when my medic then said, I said to him, the back of my shirt's wet. So he rips open my shirt and he says, oh, fuck. Now that doesn't do a lot for your morale. And I said, what's the matter? He said, you got a big hole in your back. I said, shit. One of my guys has shot me in the back, and he said, no, mate, this is a coming out wound. This is an exit wound. I thought, oh, that's some comfort, Anyway, so Mick O'Sullivan then spent the rest of the night pushing shell dressings into my back, and I nearly bled to death. And I had been hit with 2 bullets. One shattered my shoulder joint. The head of the humerus and the end of the clavicle were shattered, and the other one went further up past my collarbone and skipped off my clavicle, my shoulder blade, and tore a big hole in my back. Anyway, I mustn't have looked too flash the next morning because another platoon commander, Kevin Byrne from 10 platoon, came up and he told me years later that he thought I was going to die. I must have looked pretty ordinary. Didn't feel too flash. But I didn't go to sleep because I thought if I went to sleep, I'll die. So I stayed awake and just sipped on water every now and then. And dawn came. They did a clearing patrol, which would have been the world's scariest clearing patrol, I reckon. Section of guys swept around the whole company, no enemy. And at about 9 o'clock, a chopper came and pulled me out. And that was the end of my war. On the way back, they said, there's a bloke in B Company being wounded. Do you mind if we pick him up? And I said, no. Good mate of mine, Dan McDaniel, was hoisted up. And I hadn't known, but B Company had been in a battle over on Route 2, about 7 clicks away. And Dan had 19 in his platoon wounded that day, all from 60mm mortars. No one died, thankfully. And Dougie Milrose, one of his corporals, was mentioned in dispatches for doing counter-mortar fire with an M79 and got the enemy base plate, which I thought was pretty cool. Anyway, so back to Vung Tau by chopper. And that was the end of my war. There's a nice postscript to that, if you don't mind me going. Victor Company, because we're an Anzac battalion, so we had a company of Kiwis. Victor Company were told to come and marry up with us because we'd had 5 killed and about half a dozen wounded in the company, because Spingo had 4 wounded and my sergeant and I had been wounded, and 12 platoon had lost Jimmy Duff and I'd lost my 4. And by the time Victor Company got to Delta Company, because it was thick J where they had to go, it wasn't until that evening on the 22nd. Anyway, on the 23rd, Victor Company swept back up through the battle area, which was really hard to do because of all the deadfall from the artillery and bombs and everything. It was hard going. Anyway, they got there and they found my 3 men, and they took a couple of guys from Delta Company, Corporal Dowell and someone else, to find the battle site, and they recovered the guys, and because they used the chopper pad that they'd evacuated the other guys from, and the Victor Company guys who cleared the route for the stretchers to carry the dead, then lined that extraction route and did a shoulder arms, which was pretty good, and great mark of respect. And they got them out, and then I actually saw their bodies being brought in to the field ambulance, to the field hospital down in Vung Tau at Wanos Field Hospital, because the chopper came in and someone said, "Oh, these are the guys from the battle," and I saw their bodies being gurneyed in to the morgue, which was pretty awful.
You've been evacuated, and how long did you spend in hospital after you had been shot?
I got admitted to hospital on the 22nd of September 1971 and discharged from hospital on the 30th of October 1972. Yeah, so it's not like in the movies. You don't get shot and turn up for work the next day with your arm in a sling. No, I had a lot of infection because I'd been out in the dirt, and I had to have... it took a long time to get rid of all the infections, and then we realised I had to have an arthrodesis because we couldn't put an artificial joint into my shoulder. So I had an arthrodesis, 6 months in a plaster cast, became very good at playing 500 in hospital. Yeah, but I could still walk around, even though I was in this body cast from my waist to my neck and my arm. Several hospitals, but I was another fortnight before I could be taken out of Vietnam. I didn't leave Vietnam until the 4th or 5th of October 71. But now on to the blue on blue. On the 18th of September, I think it was, we'd had a large resupply, but the company got together for this resupply. And we all came in to join company headquarters in 12 platoon, and we came in through the bush from the east, and 10 platoon came in from the southeast. And the company was all together. We got our mail, we had a change of greens, the salad rolls, the flavoured milk, all that stuff. Got bombed up again with more ammunition and grenades and stuff like that. Claymore mines that we'd expended, because we used to carry about 18 Claymore mines in a platoon, in each platoon, because we did a lot of Claymore ambushing and stuff like that. Then in the afternoon, we're moving out, and my scout had been in Nui Dat, came out, joined the platoon, and I said, right, we'll move out on the track we came in on for a couple of 100 metres, and then when we get to the end of that, we'll then be going on a bearing up to our new area of operations. So we cleared out to the east and southeast. We're now going to go northeast and north, and that was taking us up towards Nui Le, Nui Sao area, with the intent, I think, of clearing up to the border. Anyway, We only get 100 metres out of the position. We got this stop where you are. We've got to take a crypto message. So we got this message that had been encrypted, and it said they've just had an intelligence report that there is a large formation of enemy within 400 metres of your projected night location where you're heading tonight. So I call the section commanders back in. I say, right, guys, there's lots of bad guys in the area. Stay switched on. Now, while I'm doing that, I didn't realise that 10 platoon had moved up and were on the track that I had used to come in. So we stand up and we move out. We only went 100 metres, if that, 200 metres maybe. And there's shooting from the front of my platoon. Rat-a-tat-tat, I hear contact, wait out. I give contact, wait out, and then I heard on the radio from 10 platoon, contact, wait out. My stomach did a total flip, and I realised we've run into 10 platoon. So everyone checks fire. We had check fire, yelling out, stop, stop, stop. And my scout had fired 2 shots. He hit one guy in the head, and the other guy nicked his ball bag, and his balls came up the size of a black basketball. Normally you would be patting him on the back for good shooting, but 10 platoon had come onto our track. It was my opinion that they were in the wrong area. Anyway, so we go forward, we extract the dead and the wounded guy, and then we move on. We get to our night lock, we hunker down for the night, and then the next day I had to go back that was on the 19th. Next day I had to go back and there was an investigation, and that was conducted by our company second in command. And so I had to take back my lead section commander and the guy who'd fired the shots. That was it. Then back to work, and away we went. What do I do about a man who's just done that? Just accidentally shot and killed another Australian? Well, I put his section at the back of the platoon, and my sergeant, who travelled at the rear of the platoon, kept an eye on him. But it affected him deeply for many, many years. It took him almost 15 years to come to our first platoon reunion, because he had it in his mind that we would think he was not a good soldier. I mean, that's the way your brain gets screwed. But we only had nothing but sympathy and empathy for the man. I mean, the most terrible thing. Then the next day was the 20th, and we're into it again. And that was the day we had the big contact, and then the next day was the Battle of Nui Lay. So the blue on blue was just one of those tragic accidents. You know, we had our eyes peeled. My scout had eyes like a wild cat, ears like an elephant. He's ready to go, and
just wrong place, wrong time. Just one of those situations that just unfortunately it happened, and all you've got is empathy. That's all you can. Yeah, it's just terrible, Gary.
No,
just absolutely.
It was terrible.
It
was
absolutely, and
yeah, terrible.
So you have the blue on blue, and then Nui Lay, and you go into that, and you for your actions at Nui Lay, you were awarded the last Imperial Military Cross for bravery and leadership. Can you tell us what that means to you, being awarded that for your leadership and your actions of that day?
Well, it was, you know, you don't think about gongs when you're in a war. You do not, unless you're a super egotist. All you want to do is kill the enemy and get as many men as you can home alive. We knew when we went to Vietnam in the beginning of 71, we weren't going to win this war, and we knew that we probably weren't going to get a full tour of duty. Well, our company almost got a full tour of duty because they didn't get out until March 72. But you come back. I'm back in Townsville. I'm still in hospital, but I'm in Townsville. And I was allowed to go home every couple of days. And I got this call because I was married, and I had a married quarter in Lillypilly Street in Vincent. And I get home. I've been at a Townsville District Rugby Union board meeting because I was on the board. I'd been dobbed in by my boss because I couldn't go to work. That's what I do, things like that. Because I had my arm in a sling all the time at this stage. It still hadn't been, there were bits of bone floating around. Anyway, I get home, my wife said, the CO came around, the acting CO came around. When you get back from the meeting, he wants you to go around to his place. He's got something important to tell you. So it had been, so I go around. I walk in and Ted Stevenson was the acting CO, and he asked me how I was. I said, fine. And I was getting ready to study for my captain's exams. And how's your study going? Well, it wasn't. But I was doing something. And he said, well, I'm here to, I've got to tell you that tomorrow morning there'll be a press release and you are going to find yourself awarded the Military Cross for gallantry. I thought, okay. Like, my commanding officer had an MC, my company 2IC had a Military Cross because he was in the SAS in Vietnam, and then one of the other captains got an MC for using a flamethrower in a set of caves, rescuing his deers with 7 around. I think, and these are guys you look up to, you know, they're holy dooly. And I said, oh. And I said, what's it for? He said, oh, you'll find out tomorrow. I had no idea. I didn't know if it was for something I'd done down on the Song Car when I jumped up on the back of a tank and directed fire with a weapon full of tracer at the enemy when we captured the American gun, or what, you know. So anyway, I go home. My wife said, what was all that about? And I said, oh, Ted Stevenson, because I wasn't allowed to tell anyone except my wife, but no one else. And I said, well, Ted Stevenson said that I'd be awarded the Military Cross tomorrow. And my wife, and she'd be married to me for a year. And she went, yeah, sure. So we go off to bed, right? And I could only sleep on my back, so it was really difficult to do and not snore, you know. So, because I'd wake up every now and then with a pillow over my head. Anyway, we go to sleep. Well, I wasn't sleeping. I'm thinking, shit, what do I get this gong for, you know? And after a while, my wife says, in the dark, are you really going to get a Military Cross? And I said, yeah. She sits up in bed, turns on the bedside light and says, really? I said, yeah, really. Oh, shit, she said. So we get out of bed, we go into the kitchen and we have a glass of wine or something. She said, what'd you get it for? I said, I don't know. She said, oh, you must know. I said, no, I don't. I said, it might be one or two things, you know, because sometimes they gave me out for being just a seriously good commander, you know. And I didn't think it was going to be for that because I had the guilt of command, 4 dead, you know. But I didn't have any dead until the last day I was on active service. But anyway, so the next day I go to work and it's in the papers and on the radio and blah, blah, blah. You get called up to the CO's office and everyone's there. My company commander was there and it was just incredible. And then the press release comes out with the citations. So I'm reading it and going, okay, so that was it. And I I didn't think they'd mention my stupidity on the song car and standing up behind on a tank and getting everyone in the world shooting at me was worth it. Anyway, I then went back, and I'd been the pioneer platoon commander, but acting, because I couldn't do anything. So I go up there, and they've all got beer, and they're all... So that, and then my company commander and I, he got an MC for his leadership at the Songkar and Nui Lay. We get invited up to the task force commander's office, and his name was Sheldon, and he had an MC from Korea. So we go up there for morning tea, and it turns out that I'm going to be the last MC because of the citation, because it was only the 21st of September. And anyway, we have morning tea, and he asked us about the Battle of Nui Lay and all that, and this quartermaster had made up our ribbon bars already, so we've already got our ribbon bars on. And I never forget this. Sheldon said to us as we're leaving, he said, "Congratulations again, gentlemen." He said, "It's not the highest decoration we've got, but it's the prettiest, because it's a purple and white silver cross, And I thought, oh, that's pretty cool, Anyway, yeah, and then the newspapers want to interview you and TV and all that stuff. And yeah.
It's just an unbelievable story, Gary. Like I've just been sitting here with hairs standing up, just talking through the contacts and then the bunkers, and just like you said that day, you actually don't know how you came out of it alive. It's just an absolutely amazing story, and thank you for sharing it. And as you said, we've got to remember that the men that passed and in the battles, and it's why we get you on the podcast to tell these stories, to remember the men that have fallen. And all we can say is thank you for sharing that. And so after your return home, you decided to remain in the army until you retired in 1995. After your retirement, you studied Vietnamese at the School of Modern Language at Queensland University. What prompted you to study Vietnamese?
Well, I'd written In Good Company, which went gangbusters, and then my publishers said, "Well, you better write another book," because he was the goose that laid the golden egg. And I thought, all right, I'll write about an oral history. I'll do an oral history. No, there were no books on it except an American book written by a lady who was a pretty good oral historian. So I read about how to do oral histories, and I then started on a big project called Vietnam Fragments, which ended up being the Western Hemisphere's largest oral history on the Vietnam War. And then we then edited that again, and that became Bullets, Beans and Bandages. And so I got to meet all these people and interview, and it was my privilege to be able to put their story into print, because they wouldn't have done it themselves. And it was just going to be the army. Then I realised to go tri-service, then I realised half the people went to war with Qantas, so I even interviewed Qantas people, and I did every trade you could imagine, and because everyone had a part to play. And I realised that my own experience as well, like on the world's biggest pizza, was a very, very thin slice of pizza pie. And then the Australian War Memorial rang me when I was teaching at Staff College, and they said, "We've read a couple of your books. Why don't you apply for a research grant?" And I said, "Because I don't have a PhD in history," because everyone who had a PhD in history were able to get these grants, it seemed. And the senior historian, Peter, I'll remember his name, Peter, rang me, and when I was on tour up in Gladstone, and he said, "Well, what are you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm doing a tour around Australia with all the Staff College students, and I haven't got time to do that because I wanted it in by the end of the week. He said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll fill it out for you. When are you going to be in a place where you can sign a fax?" I said, "Oh, Darwin, in a day's time." So I get at the hotel at Darwin, and there's my application for the John Trelaw Research Grant, which is an AWM grant, waiting for me. It's all been filled out by the senior historian at the AWM. I sign it, and I got the grant. So they said, "What are you going to write about?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to go and talk to the enemy and find out, because everyone said Australians are great jungle fighters, but what do the enemy think?" Because I just wanted to do that, and I was going to do a book, and it was going to be called Delta 4, and it was going to be my legacy to the Infantry Corps. He said, "Okay, well, you better learn a bit about Vietnam." And I said, "Okay." And I thought, and a couple of mates of mine in Brisbane were learning Vietnamese, and I thought, because they learned not only the language, but the history and the culture of Vietnam, which are very important. So off I went to the School of Modern Languages. I was almost about to leave the army because my first wife was terminally ill with cancer, and I'd been posted to Victoria Barracks in Brisbane. And so I was getting ready to separate because I wasn't going to be able to look after the kids and do a whole lot of stuff. Anyway, I started studying Vietnamese, and then I found out that the 6 tones in the Vietnamese language are good if you've got perfect hearing, but I don't. And so I am probably Australia's worst Vietnamese linguist. I've brought many a Vietnamese to their knees with laughter when I try to converse, but they get the message. They know what I'm about. I then went back to Vietnam to do the book Delta 4, and I had the privilege of meeting my former enemy, and but I couldn't keep up. I mean, I really needed to have done a 6-month immersion, but I think even because I'm deaf in my right ear, thanks to my sergeant, but he did save my life. It did open up a lot of doors in Vietnam. If you say hello and all that, and they realise you can speak it a little bit, they really warm to you.
So you've, as you just mentioned, you finished your language, and you've returned many times to Vietnam, led battlefield tours, and met with former enemies. After participating in what was possibly Australia's most unpopular war, what are your thoughts about the legacy of those who served there and what they achieved, and how should they be remembered?
Okay. The reason I became a tour guide is I went back on my research trip, and this guy said he was a tour guide. He wasn't a tour guide's backside. He didn't speak the language either. Not that you have to, but he had a very poor opinion of the Vietnamese. He had no respect for the enemy. He was a veteran, but he was a digger with no qualifications at all to speak of. His knowledge of the war was incorrect, if not wrong, totally. I thought, I can do this better than this clown. So I started doing private tours, and then a company in South Australia heard about it. And before long, I was going 3 or 4 times a year. I've probably done 40-odd tours. And Matt McLaughlin's battlefield tours picked me up about a decade ago, and I've been doing tours with them and other groups ever since. But it was during my first trip back in 1993 that I learned about the Australian legacy, I think, in Vietnam. I was interviewing a bloke who'd been a former Viet Cong digger and then an officer. He'd been at the Battle of Long Tan as a corporal, and then he'd been a subunit and unit commander in D445 Regiment, which was the local force battalion. And he was now the chairman of the People's District Committee in a town called Long Dien, which is just east of Nui Dat, going out towards the coast. And everywhere I went, when people were my interpreter, who I did many tours of Vietnam with, was a bloke called Hiep, H-I-E-P, and Hiep would introduce me, tell my former enemy that I was a former soldier, and they'd want to know about me, blah, 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 and I would be treated like a brother. And I found this unusual. I wasn't expecting it. There was no animosity, no anger, no hatred. As one man said to me one day, it's good that you're back here shooting us with your cameras and not your guns. I mean, that's their sense of humour, you know. And anyway, I asked this guy one day, I said, why is it that you treat your former enemy the way you do? Because he had a totally different opinion of Americans and South Vietnamese to Australians. And he said, well, the Nui Up, Up is spelt U-C, but it's pronounced like Up with a P. Nui means the people of, people from the Great Southern Land, you know. He said, the Nui Up, he said, there are four things. He said, one, you buried our dead. Two, you took care of our wounded. Three, you tried to do something for the people of the province, you know, because we built roads and bridges, we reticulated water and we put windmills in and dug wells, all winning hearts and minds stuff, which really was worth it. And he said, and lastly, the Nui Up, you did not commit atrocities. Now, everybody did. No, I'm not saying Australians did, but the Americans, the South Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the Viet, they did commit atrocities at various standards and levels. It was one of the brutal parts of war. But in the whole, Australians conducted themselves admirably, with honour. And, you know, we're not a religious bunch of people, but we do have good Christian ethics, I believe. And I think the Australian soldiers' legacy is the fact that they did the right thing. Everyone thinks they're fighting for the right cause, no matter which side of the fence they're on or which end of the rifle range they're on. I mean, the Viet Cong and the NVA guys, they were fighting for their cause, which in reality, let's face it, it was really a civil war. It's just that we were there to help the Yanks because we needed them to fill up a vacuum after the Brits had pulled out east of Suez. But the Australian soldier conducted himself with honour. I think that's their legacy. There's just a couple of more things if I could add, Adam.
Absolutely.
One is going back to the MC. My platoon gets together every couple of years. Now, we've been doing that for 30 years. And the very first time we all got back together, and we have our Nui Lei, we have a service, then we have a Nui Lei dinner. And we have the service towards the late afternoon when the battle took place. And then we have the Nui Lei dinner. And one of the first things I said to them, standing up in front of them with my medals on, was that the military cross that I wear on behalf of them. it's our military cross, because if we hadn't stayed together and fought together the way we did, especially at the very end, none of us would be here today. And as you've heard me say, none of us thought we were going to get out of that alive. And the last thing is, and it probably is reflected in the current thing going on about looking into suicide amongst veterans. People should remember that when soldiers came back from the war in Vietnam, there was no debriefing. There was no counselling, and there was very little support. And thankfully, the Vietnam experience, and it's why the Vietnam Veterans Association started up, was because DVA were making it extremely difficult. Thankfully, that's now changed. But we had to look after ourselves, and they're still doing it. Because if you haven't been in combat, the one thing that never leaves you, are those days in combat, those moments in heavy combat, and the death of your mates. It is there always. Now, I don't think of my blokes every day, but every week, I reckon, at some stage I'll probably think of Ralph or Kiwi or young Sprigg or Belkin, those young men. And you see, because the tragic part was, before that blue on blue, 2 of my dead came in on that chopper. They'd been with my platoon for 3 days. And that is something that has not changed since the First World War. It just seems to be fate that reinforcements often get hit. And I don't know what it is, but we put our reinforcements with the machine gun teams because that was an experienced group and they get looked after. And of course the enemy, you're a number 1 target. So 2 of these guys I didn't even know. I never really got to know them. You know, I said hello to them when they arrived, allocated them to their sections, and that was it. And that's combat.
It's hard to comprehend, Gary, especially myself being a young person sitting here listening to that, and all I can think of is that is the cost of war. Unfortunately, it's the terrible cost of war, and war is terrible. You've seen firsthand, no one wins a war. No one wins a war.
I'm glad you said that, Adam, because when I give talks to schools and that, I always finish up by saying there are no winners in a war. You know, when I was doing my research in Vietnam, when I got the research grant, I ran into this guy from Hanoi, and he would not go on tape about what I was going to ask him, right, because of the government line. Now, until that moment, the saddest thing for me was probably losing my dead. You know, guys like Ralph and Kiwi and the other 2 who I barely knew. That to me was utterly sad. And I thought that was the saddest thing that I'd run across. Then I met this guy in Hanoi, and I said to him, we had 6 missing in action from the Australian forces, and they've all been recovered. The Americans had a couple of thousand, and they've got some. I asked this guy, who was a bureaucrat in Hanoi with their defence department, I said, how many MIA are there from the People's Liberation Army, excuse me, or the National Liberation Front? He said, I can't tell you. I said, you can't or you won't? He said, no, I really don't have a firm figure. I said, what is your best guess? And it was not for publication. And I promised that. And he said, probably 250,000. And I thought about it that afternoon when I was with Hiep, and he'd been in the South Vietnamese army, and he had been in jail after being after the fall of Saigon for 7 years because he was an officer. And we were talking about that, and he talked about how many men he'd lost, which was about a platoon's worth that he'd lost in the 4 years he'd been fighting. And I was talking about when you have a contact with the enemy, they had no ID. These NVA guys had no ID. Some of the Viet Cong guys had an ID card because they were farmers by day, soldiers by night or whatever. But the NVA guys had none at all, no ID. So let's take the four that we ran into on the 20th of September. We stripped them, searched them for ID and any material of intelligence value we could find. All we came up with the fact that they had to be NVA. We then buried them. There was a bomb crater not far away. And we buried them, lest their weapons. But we buried them with all their kit, with respect. And there but for the grace of God go I, we all say. And their next of kin wouldn't even know where they are. They're only known as 4 enemy and a grid reference. And that's only accurate to within 100 metres. And that was the same throughout our whole tour. There were a whole bunch of kids that were squashed in the bunkers by the tanks at the Songkhla, and no one will ever know who they were. They're crushed, they're buried under all this debris. And there are no winners in a war, and it's one of the terrible things about war. But that's life.
I think it's a powerful way to end the show, Gary, and all I can say is thank you for coming on True Blue History and sharing your experiences. Thank you very much. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you, Adam. You're welcome.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast on whatever platform you get your podcasts. And if you feel like supporting us, you can now via our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/True Blue History, or buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/True Blue History, and check out our new website, truebluehistory.com, for more great content.